The apology loop. The moment the cable tightened around Mark's neck, Elara realized that 12,000 strangers were watching her commit what might be murder, and not one of them was calling for help. 3 hours earlier, she had been sitting on a wooden stool in a dimly lit studio, her fingers trembling as they reached for the power switch on a black ring light. The dial clicked. The light flickered to life, casting harsh shadows across her face and illuminating the foam panels that lined the walls like the interior of a padded cell. She checked the camera's flip-out screen. The red recording indicator blinked. A EC. Her SD card showed 128 GB remaining. More than enough space for the truth, though she wasn't certain the truth would fit into any container that existed. Elara smoothed her gray wool sweater and gripped the yellow legal pad in her lap. The paper was covered in dense, frantic handwriting. Pages of notes, crossed-out sentences, and one line circled twice in black ink. The apology loop. Her knuckles were white from gripping the pen so hard while writing it. She looked directly into the lens. Her reflection was small and distorted, fractured by the glass. She took a deep breath, sharp inhalation, shaky exhale, and whispered the words that would later be heard by thousands of people she had never met. Testing. My name is Elara. This is for the record. This is about Mark. Her hand reached for a glass of water on the side table. It brushed against a silver picture frame lying face down. She didn't pick it up. She didn't need to see his face right now. The image was already burned into the back of her eyelids, a permanent after-image she had stopped trying to blink away years ago. The water was lukewarm. She drank it anyway. The memory arrived like a physical blow. She had been preparing for this moment for 3 months, ever since she'd found the files. But there was no amount of preparation that could make the flashback gentle. Her mind didn't transition into it so much as fracture into it. 3 years ago, a living room with floor-to-ceiling windows and afternoon sunlight so bright it turned the space into a terrarium of dust particles and expensive furniture. She was wearing the same gray sweater she wore now, though the hem had been higher then, before years of washing in hot water had shrunk it. The blue ceramic vase had been sitting on a white pedestal. Mark's mother's vase. Everyone knew it was Mark's mother's vase because Mark mentioned it at least once every dinner party they threw. The vase was beautiful and fragile and had cost more than Elara's first car. She had never been comfortable around it. Her elbow had clipped it without her even noticing until the moment it left the pedestal. The vase had fallen in what felt like slow motion, but was, in reality, only a second or two of airtime before it hit the polished concrete floor and shattered into dozens of jagged shards. The sound had been high-pitched and final, like a scream that ended mid-note. Mark had entered from the kitchen wearing his black polo shirt, the one that made his biceps look impossibly large. He hadn't looked at the vase. He had looked at her throat, his gaze resting on the pulse point like he was timing her heartbeat. That was my mother's, Elara. Do you have any idea what you've done? His voice had been low, controlled, vibrating with something that wasn't quite rage. It was worse than rage. Rage was honest. This was performance. She had stammered something about it being an accident, and he had lunged forward, grabbing her upper arms. His fingers had dug deep into the flesh beneath the sweater, pressing hard enough to leave marks that would turn purple by morning and would stay with her for 2 weeks. I'm so sorry, Mark. It was an accident. He had shaken her once, hard enough that her head had snapped back slightly and then pulled her closer until their noses almost touched. He smelled like expensive cologne and menthol gum. The combination had made her gag. That wasn't an apology, he had whispered. Say it right. Tell me how you're a careless child who needs to be watched. Elara's eyes had filled with tears. She had looked at the floor, unable to meet his gaze, and his grip had tightened. The pain in her arms had been sharp and real and focused, and it had cleared her mind of everything except the need to make it stop. I am a careless child. I'm sorry for being so reckless with your things. Please. The word please had hung in the air between them like a confession. He had released her then, stepping back with a satisfied expression. He had kissed the top of her head like she was a dog that had finally learned to sit on command. "That's my girl," he had said. "Now clean up the mess." The video on her phone had pulled her out of the flashback. Dr. Julian Aris, the forensic psychologist, was sitting behind his mahogany desk in the sterile office where she had first heard the diagnosis for what had been happening to her for 3 years. He was wearing a navy blazer and white shirt, and on the desk in front of him was a brass nameplate that read his name and credentials in small, important letters. "Coerced apologies are not about remorse," he was saying, his voice grave and measured. "They are a weapon used to break a victim's internal sense of truth." Elara had found the video 3 weeks ago, recommended to her through a survivor forum by someone with a username that made no sense, but whose story had been too similar to her own to be coincidence. The video had 847,000 views. She was number 847,001. In the studio, holding her iPhone 14 Pro with its spiderweb crack, she watched Dr. Aris tap a silver pen on a leather-bound notebook. Page 42 had a diagram titled, "The Cycle of Submission." It was just a circle with arrows pointing the wrong way, spiraling inward instead of outward. At the bottom of the spiral was a single word: apology. When an abuser forces you to apologize for something they caused, they are rewriting your brain, Dr. Aris continued. They are making you the architect of your own prison. The video had played on a loop for her that night. She had watched it 7 times, frozen by the scientific accuracy of what she had already felt in her body. There was a name for what had been happening. There was a term. There was a reason she had felt like she was losing her mind rather than regaining it. Then she had scrolled through the comments section, her thumb moving mechanically through pages of other people's trauma, all rendered in the same Arial font and arranged in a neat, chronological order. That's when she saw it. A comment by a user named User992 that said, "Mark S. did this to me in 2018. Elara's pupils had dilated so sharply she felt physically dizzy. She had scrolled down further. Mark S. also did this to me, 2019 to 2021. Another comment. My ex Mark S. used this exact method. And another. Are we all the same, Mark? My abuser went to Columbia, psychology major. By the time she'd finished reading through the comments, she had understood that she wasn't special. Her tragedy had a pattern. Her trauma had a blueprint. Mark had a system, refined and tested, with multiple subjects and documented results. She had dropped the phone onto the desk in her studio. It had slid and hit the microphone stand with a loud metallic clang that made her jump. The ring light had reflected in her eyes like 2 white circles, and she had whispered it to the empty room. I wasn't the only one. He has a script. But discovery had turned into action, and action had turned into risk. The day after she'd found the files on Mark's old laptop, the one he'd left at her apartment by mistake 3 years ago, she had tried to leave work like nothing was different. She had clocked out at 5:47 p.m., walked to her silver Honda Civic in the parking garage, and made it exactly as far as the second row of cars before she realized she wasn't alone. The garage had been mostly empty, smelling of damp cement and exhaust. Her wet trench coat had dripped on the concrete as she fumbled with her keys. The sound of her heels had echoed off the concrete pillars, each footstep announcing her location like a beacon. Then, a black SUV's headlights had flared to life, blinding her. The engine had roared. Mark had stepped out from behind a concrete pillar, his hands in his pockets, wearing a navy leather jacket that made him look casual and dangerous in equal measure. "We haven't finished our conversation from this morning, Elara," he had said, his voice carrying across the empty garage with perfect clarity. "Get in the car." She had tried to run for her driver's side door. Mark had moved with surprising speed. He was larger than her, but not slow, never slow, and cut her off. He had grabbed her wrist, twisting it inward with a sharp, practiced motion. Her keys had flown out of her hand and skittered under her car, landing somewhere in the darkness where she couldn't reach them. "Let go, Mark! You're hurting me!" she had screamed, and her voice had bounced around the garage, making it sound like there were multiple versions of her all screaming at once. Mark had pinned her against the side of her Honda. The metal had groaned. He had used his forearm to press against her chest, the pressure just tight enough to make breathing difficult. And with his free hand, he had pulled a small digital recorder from his jacket pocket. The red rec light had blinked at her like a tiny, malevolent eye. "Apologize for leaving the house without permission," he had said, his voice dropping into that low, controlled register that was worse than shouting. "Say it into the mic or we don't go home." That's when Elara's survival instinct had overridden her conditioning. She had raised her knee sharply into his groin, not thinking, just acting. Mark had grunted and doubled over, releasing her. She had dived under her car, grabbed her keys, and rolled out the other side, scrambling for the stairwell. Her hands had scraped against the concrete, drawing blood in thin lines across her palms. She hadn't felt it. She had made it to her apartment and locked all the doors before her hands stopped shaking enough to turn a doorknob. That was when she had gone looking through Mark's old laptop in earnest. She had known about it for 3 years, had found it once and put it back, unsure if opening it would make her a snoop or a victim. The distinction had seemed important at the time. It didn't matter anymore. Sitting at her desk in the dark, lit only by the blue glow of her MacBook Pro, she had plugged in the rugged orange external hard drive. The device had whirred as it spun up, a sound like something mechanical waking from sleep. Her knuckles were bandaged with white medical tape. The scratches underneath were already beginning to bruise. She had opened the folder structure slowly. The drive was full of ordinary work files, PDFs, spreadsheets, presentations on experimental psychology. But buried deep was a subfolder marked Hidden. She had double-clicked it. 112 MP3 files appeared. They were arranged chronologically. Sarah, Apology, May, .mp3. Chloe, Apology, June.mp3. The subject must believe the fault is hers to ensure total compliance. It was a study, she had whispered to the empty room. He was studying us. But worse than the methodology document was the photograph. It showed Mark shaking hands with Dr. Aris, the forensic psychologist from the video, the expert who had been helping her understand what had happened to her. They were holding champagne glasses and smiling at what appeared to be a symposium. The caption underneath read, "Aris and Mark, Psychological Control Symposium 2021. The revelation had hit her like a physical blow. The doctor who had given her language for her trauma had been the architect designing it. The cure was the disease. The expert was the enemy. At 3 a.m., Elara's phone had vibrated violently, spinning in a circle on her desk. The caller ID had shown Mark with a terrifyingly normal picture of him smiling on a beach during better times. She had picked it up with only her thumb and forefinger, as if the phone itself might burn her, and answered on speaker. She had watched the street through the slats of the blinds while he talked. The red and blue flashing lights of police cars had been reflecting on the wet pavement below. Except they hadn't been police lights. They had been the high-powered LED strobes on Mark's SUV, positioned to create the illusion. "I've called the authorities, Elara," he had said, his voice soft and paternal, the tone he used when he was performing concern. "I told them you're having a manic episode and stole my clinical research. They're coming up in 10 minutes. She had watched him wave a single slow hand from beside his SUV. He had been holding his own phone, looking up at her window, waiting for her to break. The file transfer bar on her computer had shown 10% completion. The archives folder, all 112 recordings, was being uploaded to her cloud storage. She had 9 minutes and 45 seconds remaining. She had gone to the kitchen and pulled out a silver Wusthof chef's knife, the heavy one that cut through tomatoes like they were made of air. She had gone back to her office and driven it deep into the doorframe, wedging the door shut. The wood had split with a sharp crack that sounded almost like breaking bone. "I'm not apologizing for this," she had said to no one, and she had meant it. The front door exploded inward at 3:10 a.m. It wasn't the police. It was Mark and a massive man in a gray tactical vest. And Mark was holding a crowbar like he was born holding it. "No police, Elara. Just us," Mark had said, his voice carrying that same controlled calm he used when he knew he had won. "Where's my drive?" The guard had lunged for her office door and slammed his shoulder against it. The knife had held for a moment, the wood cracking around the lock, but only a moment. Dust had fallen from the ceiling with every impact. Elara had grabbed the hot coffee pot from the warmer and stood behind the door. When the guard's hand had reached through the splintered gap, she had poured the scalding brown liquid over his arm. The scream that had followed had been high-pitched and involuntary, the sound of pain cutting through his tactical composure like a blade. Mark had pushed the guard aside and used the crowbar to lever the door hinge. The metal had screeched, a sound that made her teeth ache. He had looked through the opening at the laptop on the desk, his eyes focused and predatory. "I can make this all go away, Elara," he had said, and his voice had been that snake-like whisper that meant he thought he had already won. "Just say you're sorry for the theft, one last time." She had looked at the screen. Upload, 98%. She had grabbed the laptop and backed toward the window, 4 stories up, nothing but darkness and wet pavement below. She had held the laptop over the ledge, tethered only by the Ethernet cable that snaked back into the wall. "Try to force an apology when this is gone," she had said. The upload had finished. 100%. The green notification had appeared on screen. "Upload complete. Shared with 50 contacts." She had already set it up before he arrived. The contacts were the DA, every member of the Survivor Forum, journalists she'd researched, victim advocacy organizations. 50 people who had been waiting for this moment. Mark had frozen. The crowbar had gone slack in his hands. Then she had looked at her streaming setup, the ring light from the original studio session, the camera she'd been using for content creation, the webcam she'd forgotten to turn off after she'd started recording her preliminary confession. All of it had still been running. All of it had been streaming directly to her channel. When Mark had rushed forward, he hadn't been rushing for the laptop. He had been rushing for her. He had wanted to make sure she never finished anything, never spoke again, never let another word escape her mouth. He had wanted to take back the narrative entirely. But Elara had grabbed the XLR microphone on its heavy metal arm. It was designed to pick up her voice with perfect clarity, and it was heavy enough to hurt when it made contact with his temple. The thud had been sickening, metal on bone, and Mark had reeled back, dropping both the phone and the recorder. He had roared and tackled her, and they had crashed into the desk together. The monitor had fallen, glass shattering. They had tumbled to the floor among the cables and broken equipment, wrestling in a tangle of wires and desperation. Elara had grabbed a long, black coiled microphone cable. She had looped it around Mark's neck from behind and pulled with all her weight, her feet braced against his spine. Her face had gone purple with effort, but she had held on, riding his back as they crashed into the bookshelf. Books had rained down on them. The psychology of influence, breaking the will, control, and compliance. Mark's fingernails had scratched her wrists as he'd clawed at the cable, trying to find purchase, trying to dislodge her, trying to make anything stop. He had tried to stand, but she had held on, the cable digging deeper into his neck. 5 more seconds. She had counted them off like a heartbeat. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then she had released the tension and immediately used the rest of the cable to tie his hands to the heavy cast iron radiator by the window. The metal had clanked as the cable wound around it, securing him in place. His blood had dripped onto the floor. From his temple where the microphone had made contact, from his neck where the cable had cut into the skin. Her own blood had been on her hands. She had been bleeding from the nose, but her hands were steady as she stood up. Elara had picked up Mark's phone from the floor and used his unconscious thumb to unlock the screen. When she'd opened the FaceTime history, she had found the call labeled Jess from 3:05 a.m. She had clicked it, and the app had opened to show VLC player running, not a FaceTime feed. The video that had been playing had been recorded 2 years ago. The metadata had confirmed it. July 12, 2022. He had edited footage of Jess from an escape room game they'd played and manipulated it to look like an actual kidnapping. He had added duct tape, dim lighting, and the sound of her muffled sobs. He had turned her sister's face into a weapon and used it to force submission. But Jess wasn't kidnapped. Jess was safe. Jess had never been in danger. The sirens had started then. Real sirens this time, the wailing sound getting louder as they approached the building. The neighbors must have heard the fight. Someone must have called emergency services for real. Elara had looked out the window and seen the blue and red lights reflecting on the wet pavement. Genuine police lights, not the LEDs from Mark's SUV. Help had actually arrived. She had picked up the silver recorder from where Mark had dropped it. She had pressed play. It had filled the room with voices, her own voice and others, begging for forgiveness for things that weren't their fault. She had dropped the recorder onto the floor and brought her heavy boot down on it. The plastic had shattered under the pressure, the metal gears grinding into fragments. Then she had turned back to her computer. The livestream chat had been scrolling at light speed, message after message stacking on top of each other. Is she okay? Police are on the way. We saw everything. Someone call her. Are you hurt? The viewer count had been climbing. 5,000 watching. 8,000 watching. 12,402 people watching as her attacker lay tied to a radiator, bleeding on her office floor. 12,000 strangers who had seen the truth unfold in real time. The uniformed officers had pulled Mark to his feet with practiced efficiency. He had been groggy, blood matted in his hair, and they had snapped silver handcuffs onto his wrists. For a moment, he had tried to find his mask, that perfect expression of concerned innocence that had worked for so long. But his face had just crumpled into pain. "I'm sorry, Elara," he had whined as they led him toward the door. "I didn't mean it. It was for the science." Elara had stood across the room, wrapped in a coarse yellow police blanket. She had watched him without speaking, holding his gaze until he looked away, unable to meet the clarity of her eyes. "I don't accept your apology," she had said. "It's not on the script." The female detective in the tan trench coat had taken the orange hard drive from her with blue latex gloves, placing it carefully into a clear plastic evidence bag. She had sealed it and written on the label, Exhibit A, Mark S. The television in the living room had been playing news coverage in the background. A banner had scrolled across the screen. Breaking. Renowned psychologist Dr. Julian Aris, arrested in connection to unethical human trials. The image had shown Dr. Aris being led out of his office in a suit, his head bowed. His mahogany desk was now covered in yellow evidence tape. Elara had sipped water from a paper cup. Her hands had been steady. She had watched Mark being led through the doorway by the officers. His posture collapsed, his authority evaporated. For the first time in years, the air in the apartment had felt light. 1 month later, she sat on a green-painted park bench beside a still lake. To her left was Sarah, a redhead wearing a bright yellow scarf. To her right was Chloe, a blonde woman with intelligent eyes and a small smile. All three were holding steaming cardboard coffee cups. The morning was sunny and clear. Birds were chirping in the trees. The water in front of them was perfectly still, like glass. "I used to think my voice didn't belong to me," Elara said. Her voice was clear now, resonant with a quality it hadn't had before. Like it was just a machine for making him feel better. Like I was borrowing it temporarily and would have to give it back. Sarah reached out and touched her hand. Her grip was warm and steady. "We're rewriting the script now," Sarah said. "Together." Chloe nodded. She didn't speak, but she didn't need to. The understanding between the three of them was deeper than words. Elara reached into her pocket and pulled out a small digital recorder, the backup she had kept from the office. She stood up, walked to the edge of the lake, and held it over the water. Her fingers released. The recorder fell with a tiny splash and sank to the bottom, disappearing into the darkness. She turned back to the bench. Around her neck was a silver chain, and attached to it was a small, sharp silver needle. It was made from the high-grade steel of the microphone Mark had once used to track her words. She had taken it to a jeweler and had it melted down and reshaped. The needle was sharp enough to draw blood if she pressed it against her skin too hard. "I have nothing to apologize for," she said. The three women stood up from the bench and began walking away together, moving toward the path that led back to the parking lot. The camera stayed on the empty bench for a moment longer, capturing the place where they had been. On the wood, carved carefully with a needle pendant, was one word: voice. Then the image faded to black,